Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Growing up in the small town of Riverside, she developed an eye for detail that served her well in her job as a school nurse. At 28, she had seen everything from scraped knees to serious allergic reactions, but nothing had prepared her for what would happen on that cold Tuesday morning in February. The day started like any other. Sarah arrived at Riverside Elementary School at 7 in the morning, an hour before the first bell. She liked the quiet time to organize her supplies and review any medical notes about students who might need special attention. The school was old but well-maintained, with long hallways that echoed every footstep and classrooms filled with the artwork and energy of 600 children. As she unlocked her office door, Sarah noticed something unusual. Mrs. Henderson, the kindergarten teacher, was already in her classroom, which was strange because she typically arrived just minutes before school started. Through the window, Sarah could see the older woman sitting at her desk with her head in her hands. Something was clearly wrong. Sarah knocked gently on the classroom door. Mrs. Henderson looked up with red, puffy eyes and quickly tried to compose herself. She had been teaching at Riverside Elementary for 32 years and was known for her calm demeanor and endless patience with the youngest students. "Margaret, are you all right?" Sarah asked, using the teacher's first name as they had become friends over the past 3 years. Mrs. Henderson shook her head slowly. "It's my grandson, Tommy. He's been missing since yesterday afternoon. The police are looking for him, but there are no leads. He's only 7 years old, Sarah. 7. Her voice broke as she spoke. Sarah felt her heart sink. She knew Tommy well because he was a student at their school, though not in Mrs. Henderson's class to avoid any potential conflicts. He was a bright, curious boy with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile that could light up a room. The thought of him being lost or worse made Sarah's stomach turn. "What happened? When did anyone last see him?" Sarah asked, pulling up a small chair to sit next to her colleague. Mrs. Henderson explained that Tommy had been playing in the park near his home after school. His mother had been watching him from their apartment window while preparing dinner. When she looked again, Tommy was gone. The playground was empty except for a few other children who said they hadn't seen where Tommy went. The police had searched the entire park and surrounding areas until well after dark with no success. "They're organizing search parties today," Mrs. Henderson continued, "but the detective said that with each hour that passes, the chances of finding him safely decrease. I feel so helpless, just sitting here." Sarah understood why Mrs. Henderson had come to school early. Sometimes keeping busy was the only way to cope with overwhelming worry. But as she listened to the story, something nagged at her. She had driven past Riverside Park on her way to work that morning, just as she did every day. The park was about 2 miles from the school, and Sarah often took that route because it was scenic and helped her start the day with a peaceful mindset. As she thought about her drive that morning, Sarah remembered something that had seemed odd at the time but hadn't registered as important. Near the park, she had seen an old blue van parked in an unusual spot. It wasn't in the regular parking area, but rather on the side of the road, partially hidden behind some large oak trees. What had caught her attention was that the van's engine was running, creating a small cloud of exhaust in the cold morning air. But she couldn't see anyone inside. At the time, Sarah had simply assumed someone was warming up their vehicle or perhaps taking a phone call. But now, with Tommy missing, that memory took on a much more sinister possibility. She had read enough news stories to know that child abductions, while rare, did happen, and they often involved someone watching and waiting for the right opportunity. "Margaret," Sarah said carefully, "I need to tell you something, but I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily. This morning on my way to work, I saw something near the park that seemed a little strange." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened, and she gripped Sarah's hand tightly. "What did you see?" Sarah described the blue van in detail. She remembered that it was an older model, possibly from the 1990s, with some rust around the wheel wells. She hadn't been close enough to see the license plate, but she recalled that there was some kind of writing on the side of the van, though she couldn't make out what it said from the distance. "Do you think it could be related to Tommy's disappearance?" Mrs. Henderson asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "It might be completely innocent. But I think the police should know about it. Every piece of information could be important." Mrs. Henderson immediately pulled out her phone and called Detective Rodriguez, who was leading the investigation into Tommy's disappearance. Sarah could hear the detective's voice through the phone, asking detailed questions about the timing and location of Sarah's sighting. "He wants to speak with you directly," Mrs. Henderson said, handing over the phone. Detective Rodriguez was professional but urgent in his questioning. He asked Sarah to describe everything she remembered about the van, the exact location where she saw it, and the time. Sarah did her best to be precise, knowing that accuracy could be crucial in a case like this. "Ms. Martinez, would you be able to take a ride with me to the location where you saw the van? Sometimes being at the exact spot can help trigger additional memories," the detective asked. Sarah looked at the clock. School would start in 30 minutes, but this was more important than anything else she had planned for the day. "Of course, I'll need to let the principal know that I'll be away from school for a while." Principal Johnson was understanding when Sarah explained the situation. He arranged for the district's substitute nurse to cover for her and told Sarah to take as much time as she needed to help with the investigation. 20 minutes later, Detective Rodriguez picked up Sarah in an unmarked police car. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. As they drove toward the park, he explained that the first 24 hours after a child goes missing are critical. "We've had search teams out all night," he said. "We've checked every house in a 2-mile radius, interviewed all the neighbors, and reviewed security camera footage from nearby businesses. Your observation about the van is the first potential lead we've had." When they reached the area where Sarah had seen the van, she was able to point out the exact spot. Detective Rodriguez examined the ground carefully and found tire tracks in the soft earth. He took photographs and called for a forensics team to make casts of the tire impressions. "The tracks are fresh," he told Sarah, "probably made within the last day or two. You've got a good eye for detail." As they stood there, Sarah found herself remembering more details about the van. The writing on the side had been in red letters, and now she thought it might have been the name of a business or company. She also recalled seeing what looked like a ladder rack on the roof, suggesting it might belong to a contractor or maintenance worker. Detective Rodriguez took notes on everything Sarah remembered and radioed the information to other officers who were canvassing the area. Within an hour, they had a bulletin out for a blue van matching Sarah's description. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they prepared to head back to town. "Now we wait and hope someone recognizes the description," the detective replied. "And we keep searching. Tommy's family has organized volunteer search parties that will be covering the woods and surrounding areas today. Every person who joins the search increases our chances of finding him." Sarah knew she had to join the search effort. Even though she had already provided crucial information to the police, she couldn't simply return to her normal routine, knowing that a 7-year-old boy was missing and possibly in danger. She asked Detective Rodriguez to drop her off at the community center where the volunteer searchers were meeting. The community center was buzzing with activity. More than 100 people had gathered, including parents from the school, local business owners, and residents from throughout the county. Tommy's parents were there, looking exhausted and desperate, but grateful for the overwhelming show of support from their community. Sarah introduced herself to the search coordinator and explained her connection to the case. She was assigned to a group that would be searching the wooded area behind the park where Tommy was last seen. The team leader, a local firefighter named Captain Walsh, briefed the volunteers on search techniques and safety protocols. "We'll be walking in a line, staying about 10 feet apart," Captain Walsh explained. "We're looking for any sign that Tommy might have passed through the area. That could include pieces of clothing, footprints, or anything that seems out of place. If you find anything, don't touch it. Call out immediately so we can mark the location." As Sarah's search team entered the woods, she found herself thinking about Tommy and what he might be experiencing if he was still alive. The boy she knew from school was brave and smart, but he was also just 7 years old, far too young to be facing whatever situation he might be in. The search was methodical and thorough. Sarah's group covered nearly 3 square miles of forest, checking under fallen logs, in small caves, and around old structures. They found a few items of trash and what appeared to be an old camping site, but nothing related to Tommy's disappearance. After 6 hours of searching, the teams regrouped at the community center. No one had found any trace of Tommy, and the mood was growing increasingly somber. Sarah overheard one of the police officers telling the search coordinator that they were expanding the search radius, which usually meant they believed the child might have been taken farther from the original location. As the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the blue van was the key to finding Tommy. She replayed her memory of that morning over and over, trying to extract every possible detail. Something was bothering her about the location where she had seen the van, but she couldn't quite identify what it was. That evening, Sarah drove back to the area where she had spotted the van, hoping that seeing the location again might trigger the memory that was nagging at her. As she parked her car and walked around the spot, she realized what had been bothering her all day. The location where the van had been parked offered a perfect view of the playground where Tommy had been playing the day before. Someone sitting in that van would have been able to watch the children at play without being easily noticed. The thick oak trees provided cover from the main road, but the view of the playground was completely unobstructed. This wasn't a coincidence. Sarah was now convinced that whoever had been in that van had been watching the children, possibly for days or weeks, looking for the right opportunity to strike. The thought made her feel sick, but it also strengthened her resolve to do everything possible to help find Tommy. Sarah immediately called Detective Rodriguez and shared her realization about the van's position. The detective listened carefully and asked her to meet him at the police station to look through photographs of similar vehicles and see if she could provide any additional details that might help identify the specific van. At the police station, Sarah spent 2 hours looking through hundreds of photographs of blue vans, trying to find one that matched what she had seen. Finally, she found an image that was very close to what she remembered, though she couldn't be certain it was the exact same vehicle. "This is very helpful," Detective Rodriguez told her. "We've already put out alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. If this van is involved in Tommy's disappearance, we'll find it." As Sarah prepared to leave the police station, she felt a mix of hope and anxiety. She had done everything she could think of to help with the investigation, but there were no guarantees that it would be enough. All she could do now was pray that Tommy would be found safe, and that her memories of the suspicious van would somehow lead to his rescue. The next morning brought no good news. Sarah woke up early, hoping to hear that Tommy had been found during the night, but the local news reported that the search was continuing with no new developments. She felt restless and anxious, unable to focus on her normal routine while knowing that a child was still missing and possibly in grave danger. At school, the atmosphere was subdued. Many of the teachers had participated in the previous day's search efforts, and everyone was affected by the situation. Mrs. Henderson had decided to stay home to be with Tommy's family, so a substitute teacher was covering her kindergarten class. The young children sensed that something serious was happening, even though the adults tried to maintain a normal environment. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to drive around some of the neighborhoods near the park. not really expecting to find anything but feeling like she needed to do something active rather than just waiting for news. She had become familiar with the area during the previous day's search, and she thought that maybe seeing it again in different lighting conditions might reveal something new. As she drove slowly through a residential area about 3 miles from the park, Sarah noticed a house that looked abandoned. The yard was overgrown with weeds, several windows were boarded up, and there was a general air of neglect about the property. What caught her attention, however, was a glimpse of blue paint visible through a partially open garage door. Sarah's heart began to race. She parked her car across the street and tried to get a better view of what was in the garage. The opening was narrow, but she could definitely see part of a blue vehicle. It could be a car, truck, or van, and it might be completely unrelated to Tommy's case. But given the lack of other leads, Sarah felt she had to investigate further. She called Detective Rodriguez immediately and described what she had found. He instructed her to stay in her car and not approach the house under any circumstances, explaining that if this was related to the kidnapping, the situation could be extremely dangerous. "I'm sending units to your location right now," the detective said. "Can you give me the exact address?" Sarah read the house numbers from the mailbox and described the intersection where the house was located. Within minutes, she could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached her position. 3 police cars arrived almost simultaneously, followed by Detective Rodriguez in his unmarked vehicle. The officers spread out around the property while the detective approached Sarah's car to get a more detailed description of what she had observed. "You did the right thing by calling this in," he told her. "We need to check out every possible lead, no matter how unlikely it might seem." Sarah watched from a safe distance as 2 officers approached the house, while others positioned themselves around the back and sides of the property. The front door appeared to be locked, but they were able to see through a window that the house was furnished, suggesting it might not be as abandoned as it appeared from the outside. When the officers checked the garage, they confirmed that there was indeed a blue van inside, and it matched the general description that Sarah had provided. The license plate ran back to a Robert Clayton, age 43, who had a criminal record including charges for breaking and entering and assault. "We need to get a search warrant for the house and the vehicle," Detective Rodriguez explained to Sarah. "This process could take a few hours, but if Tommy is in there, we'll find him." The waiting was agonizing. Sarah remained at the scene, feeling like she needed to see this through to the end. More police units arrived, including specialists from the state police and FBI agents who had been called in to assist with the case. The house was completely surrounded, ensuring that no one could enter or leave without being detected. After what felt like an eternity, Detective Rodriguez received the call confirming that the search warrant had been approved by a judge. A SWAT team moved into position, and Sarah watched as officers prepared to enter the house. The tension in the air was palpable, and she found herself holding her breath as the operation began. The entry team went through the front door while other officers simultaneously entered through the back. Sarah could hear shouting from inside the house, but she was too far away to make out the specific words. Her heart was pounding as she waited to learn what the officers had found. 10 minutes later, Detective Rodriguez's radio crackled with news that changed everything. They had found Tommy alive in a back bedroom of the house. He appeared to be unharmed, but was understandably frightened and confused. The suspect, Robert Clayton, had been arrested without resistance. Sarah felt overwhelming relief wash over her as she watched paramedics rush into the house to check on Tommy's condition. A few minutes later, she saw the little boy being carried out in the arms of a police officer, wrapped in a blanket but alert and looking around at all the activity surrounding him. Detective Rodriguez approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. "You found him," he said simply. "Your observation about that van led us directly to Tommy. Without your attention to detail and willingness to get involved, we might never have found him." Sarah was too emotional to respond immediately. She watched as Tommy was placed in an ambulance, not because he was injured, but to take him to the hospital for a complete medical evaluation. The sight of the little boy safe and alive was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As news of Tommy's rescue spread throughout the community, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that she had never expected or wanted. Reporters from local television stations and newspapers wanted to interview her about how she had spotted the suspicious van and helped locate the missing child. "I just happened to notice something that seemed out of place," Sarah told the journalists. "Any concerned citizen would have done the same thing. The real heroes are the police officers and all the volunteers who worked tirelessly to bring Tommy home safely." But the community saw Sarah as much more than just a concerned citizen who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Word spread quickly about how the school nurse had not only provided the crucial clue that broke the case, but had also actively participated in the search efforts and continued investigating on her own until Tommy was found. Tommy's family was eager to meet and thank Sarah personally. When she visited them at the hospital, Tommy's mother, Jennifer, couldn't stop crying as she hugged Sarah and tried to express her gratitude. "You brought my baby back to me," Jennifer said through her tears. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You saved his life." Tommy himself seemed remarkably resilient for a 7-year-old who had just been through such a traumatic experience. He told Sarah that he remembered her from school and asked if she was the nurse who had the special Band-Aids with cartoon characters on them. "That's me," Sarah said with a smile, grateful to see that Tommy's spirit hadn't been broken by his ordeal. Over the following days, the details of Tommy's kidnapping emerged through the police investigation. Robert Clayton had been watching children at the park for several weeks, looking for an opportunity to abduct someone. He had specifically chosen Tommy because the boy had been playing alone, slightly apart from the other children, making him an easier target. Clayton had approached Tommy and told him that his mother had sent him to pick him up from the park. Being only 7 years old and trusting of adults, Tommy had gotten into the van without resistance. Clayton had taken him to the abandoned house where he planned to hold him for ransom. But he had become paranoid about the police investigation and hadn't made any demands for money. The district attorney later explained that Tommy had likely been saved from much worse treatment if he had remained in Clayton's custody for much longer. The man had a history of violent behavior and had been deteriorating mentally in recent months. Sarah learned that her description of the van had been circulated to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Several officers had spotted vehicles matching the description, but none had turned out to be the right one until Sarah herself had noticed the van in Clayton's garage. The investigation also revealed that Clayton had been responsible for a series of attempted child abductions in neighboring communities over the past year. In each case, he had used the same blue van and similar tactics. Tommy's rescue had potentially prevented other children from becoming victims. The local police department decided to hold a ceremony to formally recognize Sarah's contribution to Tommy's rescue. Chief Patterson explained that while civilians often provide helpful information in criminal cases, it was rare for someone to show such persistence and courage in following up on their observations. Ms. Martinez could have simply reported what she saw and moved on with her life, Chief Patterson said. Instead, she remained engaged with the investigation, participated in search efforts, and continued looking for clues until Tommy was found. Her actions represent the very best of civic responsibility and community spirit. The ceremony was held at Riverside Elementary School, with Tommy's family, school staff, and community members in attendance. Sarah felt nervous about being the center of attention, but she was honored to be recognized for helping to save Tommy's life. As she stood before the gathered crowd, Sarah reflected on how a simple drive to work had led to such an extraordinary series of events. She thought about all the small decisions that had contributed to Tommy's rescue. Choosing to take the scenic route that morning, noticing something unusual about the parked van, deciding to get involved rather than assuming someone else would handle it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention to what's happening around us, Sarah said during her brief remarks. We all have opportunities every day to help our neighbors and protect our community. This week, I happened to notice something that turned out to be important, but any of you might have done the same thing. The audience applauded warmly, but Sarah knew that the real reward was seeing Tommy back in his classroom, happy and safe, surrounded by friends who had missed him terribly during his absence. Mrs. Henderson had returned to work with renewed energy and appreciation for every normal day with her students. In the weeks that followed, Sarah received letters and cards from people throughout the region who had been following Tommy's story. Parents thanked her for helping to make their communities safer. Children drew pictures showing her as a superhero with a nurse's cap and a cape. One letter particularly touched Sarah's heart. It was from an elderly man whose own grandson had gone missing 20 years earlier and was never found. He wrote that seeing Tommy rescued gave him hope that other families might be spared the pain his family had endured. Sarah kept that letter as a reminder of why her actions had mattered so much. It wasn't just about one little boy, though Tommy's life was certainly precious enough to justify everything she had done. It was about the principle that people have a responsibility to look out for one another, especially when children are involved. The story of Tommy's rescue became a case study used in law enforcement training programs to illustrate the importance of civilian cooperation in missing child investigations. Detective Rodriguez often spoke at conferences about how Sarah's careful observation and willingness to stay involved had been crucial to the successful outcome. Sarah returned to her normal routine as the school nurse, but she found that the experience had changed her in subtle but important ways. She paid even closer attention to her surroundings during her daily commute, and she was more likely to stop and investigate when something seemed unusual or out of place. She also became an advocate for child safety education, working with local police to develop programs that would teach children and parents about staying safe in public places. The programs emphasized the importance of trusting instincts when something didn't feel right and knowing how to get help quickly in emergency situations. 6 months after Tommy's rescue, life in Riverside had largely returned to normal, but the impact of those dramatic few days continued to resonate throughout the community. Sarah had settled back into her routine as the school nurse, though she remained more vigilant than ever about the safety and well-being of the children in her care. The local police department had implemented new protocols for missing child cases, largely based on lessons learned from Tommy's disappearance and rescue. Detective Rodriguez had been promoted to lieutenant, partly in recognition of his handling of the case, and he often credited Sarah's persistence as being crucial to the successful outcome. Tommy himself had shown remarkable resilience in recovering from his ordeal. With the help of counseling and the support of his family and school community, he had returned to his normal activities and maintained his cheerful, energetic personality. He had even developed something of a special friendship with Sarah, always greeting her enthusiastically when he saw her in the school hallways. One crisp morning in October, Sarah was organizing supplies in her office when Principal Johnson knocked on her door. He was accompanied by a woman in a police uniform whom Sarah didn't recognize. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Officer Patricia Valdez," Principal Johnson said. "She's with the state police, and she has something she'd like to discuss with you." Officer Valdez was a woman in her 30s, with a professional demeanor and kind eyes. She shook Sarah's hand warmly and explained that she had been following the story of Tommy's rescue and Sarah's role in finding him. "Ms. Martinez, I've been working with missing children cases for 8 years, Officer Valdez said. "What you did in Tommy's case was extraordinary, but I'm here because we believe you might be able to help us with another situation." Sarah felt a familiar mix of concern and determination. "What kind of situation?" Officer Valdez explained that there had been a pattern of attempted child abductions across the state over the past year. In each case, the perpetrator had used a different vehicle and approach, but there were enough similarities to suggest that the same person might be responsible for all the attempts. "We believe this individual is highly organized and methodical," Officer Valdez continued. "They seem to study their targets for weeks before making an attempt, and they're very careful about avoiding detection. The problem is that they've gotten better at avoiding cameras and witnesses." The officer opened a folder and showed Sarah photographs and maps related to the various incidents. Each attempted abduction had occurred near a school or playground, always during times when children were present, but adult supervision was minimal. In 3 of the cases, witnesses reported seeing vehicles that seemed out of place in the area, but the descriptions have been too vague for us to develop solid leads, Officer Valdez explained. "Your ability to notice and remember details about the van in Tommy's case has made you somewhat famous among law enforcement circles." Sarah studied the materials Officer Valdez had brought. The pattern was indeed troubling, and she could see why the police were concerned about escalation. In each case, the perpetrator had gotten closer to successfully abducting a child. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked. "We'd like you to visit each of these locations and see if you notice anything that might have been missed in the initial investigations," Officer Valdez said. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal details that others overlooked. Your background as a nurse also means you're trained to observe carefully and think systematically about problems." Sarah felt honored to be asked, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the responsibility. "I'm not a detective or a trained investigator." "No, but you're someone who saved a child's life by paying attention and following through on what you observed," Officer Valdez replied. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need." After discussing the request with Principal Johnson, who was fully supportive of Sarah's involvement, she agreed to spend her weekend visiting the locations where the attempted abductions had occurred. Officer Valdez would accompany her to provide security and additional context about each incident. Their first stop was a playground in the city of Millfield, about an hour's drive from Riverside. The attempted abduction had occurred 3 weeks earlier when a man had approached an 8-year-old girl and tried to convince her to come with him to look for a lost puppy. The girl had been smart enough to refuse and run to her mother, who was sitting on a bench nearby. As Sarah walked around the playground and surrounding area, she tried to imagine how the perpetrator might have observed the location before making his attempt. The playground was visible from several different vantage points, including a parking lot across the street and a walking path that ran along a creek behind the play area. The mother said she had been bringing her daughter to this playground every Tuesday and Thursday for about a month before the incident, Officer Valdez explained. It's possible the suspect had been watching and learning their routine. Sarah noticed something interesting about the parking lot across the street. There were several spaces that offered a clear view of the playground, but were partially obscured by a large billboard. Someone could sit in a car there for extended periods without being easily noticed by people in the park. "Have you checked with the businesses around here to see if anyone noticed vehicles parked in that area for unusually long periods?" Sarah asked. Officer Valdez made a note to follow up on that suggestion. They spent another hour at the location, with Sarah asking questions and pointing out details that might be relevant to understanding how the perpetrator had planned and attempted the abduction. Their next stop was a school in the town of Oakwood, where a man had approached a group of children walking home after classes ended. He had told them he was looking for someone to help him carry groceries to his car, but one of the children had recognized this as a potential danger and led the group away from the man. At this location, Sarah noticed that the street where the incident occurred had very little foot traffic, making it an ideal place for someone to approach children without many witnesses. However, she also observed that there were security cameras on several buildings that might have captured footage of the incident. "Were you able to get video from those cameras?" Sarah asked, pointing to the devices she had spotted. We tried, but most of them either weren't working or had their recordings overwritten before we could access them, Officer Valdez replied. It's frustrating, but it happens more often than you'd think. As they continued visiting locations, Sarah began to see a pattern in how the perpetrator chose their targets and timing. Each incident had occurred in an area where children were present, but where adult supervision was either minimal or distracted. The perpetrator also seemed to prefer locations with multiple escape routes, suggesting careful advance planning. This person is definitely conducting surveillance before making their attempts, Sarah observed. They know the routines of potential victims and the patterns of activity at each location. Officer Valdez agreed and explained that this level of planning was what made the case so challenging. We're dealing with someone who is patient, methodical, and intelligent. That makes them much more dangerous than an impulsive predator. On their final stop of the day at a community center in the town of Riverside Heights, Sarah made a discovery that would prove to be significant. The attempted abduction there had occurred during a Saturday morning soccer practice when a man had tried to lure a 10-year-old boy away from the field by claiming to be a coach from another team. As Sarah examined the area around the soccer fields, she noticed tire tracks in a muddy area behind a maintenance building. The tracks appeared to be relatively fresh, and their location suggested that someone had parked there to watch the soccer practice while remaining hidden from view. These tracks look like they might be from a larger vehicle, maybe a truck or van, Sarah said, kneeling down to examine them more closely. Officer Valdez called for a forensics team to come and make casts of the tire tracks. While they waited, Sarah continued to explore the area and found something even more interesting: cigarette butts scattered near where the vehicle had been parked. If these are from our suspect, they could provide DNA evidence, Officer Valdez said excitedly. You might have just given us our first real physical evidence in this case. The cigarette butts were carefully collected and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. While DNA results would take several weeks to process, the discovery reinvigorated the investigation and provided a new avenue for potentially identifying the suspect. Word of Sarah's involvement in the multi-jurisdictional investigation spread quickly through law enforcement circles. Within a week, she received requests from police departments in 2 neighboring states asking for her assistance with similar cases. Detective Rodriguez, now Lieutenant Rodriguez, was proud, but not surprised by Sarah's continued success in helping with investigations. Sarah has a unique combination of observational skills, analytical thinking, and genuine concern for child safety, he told reporters who were following the story. She's become an invaluable resource for law enforcement. 3 weeks after the tire tracks and cigarette butts were found, the state crime lab called with results. The DNA from the cigarette butts matched a man named Marcus Webb, who was already in the system due to a previous conviction for stalking. When police tracked down Webb, they found that he was driving a dark green pickup truck with tires that matched the tracks found at the community center. Webb's arrest led to the discovery of detailed notes and photographs documenting his surveillance of various schools and playgrounds throughout the state. He had been planning abductions for months, gathering information about children's routines and identifying the best opportunities to approach them without being caught. The evidence also revealed that Webb had been responsible for not just the recent attempted abductions, but also several successful kidnappings in other states over the past 3 years. His arrest potentially saved dozens of children from becoming victims of his increasingly bold attempts. At the press conference announcing Webb's arrest, the state attorney general specifically thanked Sarah for her contributions to the investigation. Ms. Martinez's observations and analytical approach were instrumental in gathering the evidence that led to Mr. Webb's capture, he said. Her work has undoubtedly prevented additional children from being harmed. The announcement of Webb's arrest was met with relief and celebration throughout the communities that had been affected by his activities. Parents felt safer allowing their children to play in parks and walk to school. knowing that a dangerous predator had been removed from their neighborhoods. For Sarah, the successful conclusion of the case brought a deep sense of satisfaction, but she was also aware of the soberness of the situation. The investigation had revealed how vulnerable children could be and how important it was for communities to remain vigilant about protecting them. A month after Webb's arrest, the annual awards ceremony for the state police was held in the capital city. Sarah received an invitation to attend as a guest of honor, recognizing her civilian contributions to law enforcement efforts to protect children. The ceremony was held in a grand ballroom with hundreds of police officers, government officials, and community leaders in attendance. Sarah felt nervous about being in such a formal setting, but she was honored to be recognized alongside the professional law enforcement officers who dedicated their careers to public safety. As the evening progressed, various awards were presented to officers who had shown exceptional courage, dedication, and effectiveness in their duties. Sarah watched with admiration as men and women who had risked their lives to protect others were acknowledged for their service. Near the end of the ceremony, the Master of Ceremonies announced a special presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a unique situation tonight. While most of our awards recognize the outstanding work of sworn law enforcement officers, we sometimes have the privilege of honoring civilians who have made extraordinary contributions to public safety." Sarah's heart began to race as she realized that this announcement was about her. The Master of Ceremonies continued. "Ms. Sarah Martinez has demonstrated that being a good citizen sometimes means going far beyond what is expected or required. Her observation skills and willingness to get involved have directly resulted in the rescue of one child and the arrest of a dangerous predator who threatened children throughout our state." As Sarah's name was called, she made her way to the front of the ballroom where the state police superintendent was waiting with a special commendation. The audience, composed primarily of law enforcement officers, rose to give her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But the most meaningful moment of the evening was yet to come. As Sarah accepted her commendation, she noticed a familiar figure in dress blues approaching the podium. It was Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had played such an important role in Tommy's rescue and had become a friend and mentor to Sarah over the months since then. Lieutenant Rodriguez took the microphone and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I had the privilege of working with Ms. Martinez during one of the most challenging cases of my career. What I witnessed was not just someone who happened to notice something important, but a person who embodies the very best qualities of citizenship: attention to detail, moral courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of our society." He turned to face Sarah directly. "Ms. Martinez, on behalf of all law enforcement officers who have had the honor of working with you, and on behalf of the children whose lives you have helped protect, I want to present you with something that represents our deepest respect and gratitude." Lieutenant Rodriguez then did something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes and sent a murmur of appreciation through the audience. He stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a sharp, formal military salute to Sarah, holding it as the entire room of law enforcement officers followed suit. The sight of hundreds of police officers saluting a civilian was unprecedented in the history of the State Police Awards ceremony. It was a gesture that conveyed respect not just for Sarah's specific actions, but for the principle that protecting children and communities is a responsibility that extends beyond those who wear badges. As Sarah stood there, overwhelmed by the honor being shown to her, she thought about Tommy playing safely at school, about Marcus Webb in custody where he could no longer harm children, and about all the parents who could sleep a little easier knowing that their communities were protected by people who truly cared. The salute lasted for nearly a minute before Lieutenant Rodriguez and the other officers returned to their normal positions. The audience erupted in applause once again, and Sarah knew that this moment would remain with her for the rest of her life. In her brief remarks to the audience, Sarah emphasized that her actions had been motivated by a simple belief that everyone has a responsibility to protect children. Any parent in this room would have done exactly what I did if they had seen something suspicious, she said. The real heroes are the men and women who do this work every day, who put their lives on the line to keep our communities safe. As the ceremony concluded and people began to leave, Sarah was approached by numerous officers who wanted to thank her personally and share their own stories about cases involving missing children. She was struck by how much these tough, professional law enforcement officers cared about the children in their communities and how meaningful her contributions had been to them. The story of Sarah's recognition and the unprecedented salute she received spread far beyond the law enforcement community. News outlets across the country picked up the story as an example of extraordinary citizenship and community responsibility. Sarah received letters from parents, teachers, and children who were inspired by her example. More importantly, the publicity surrounding Sarah's story led to increased awareness about child safety and the importance of paying attention to suspicious activities in communities. Several other cases of missing or endangered children were solved when observant citizens came forward with information, citing Sarah's example as inspiration for their involvement. Today, Sarah continues to work as a school nurse in Riverside, but her life has been forever changed by the events that began with her simple observation of a suspicious van. She has become a sought-after speaker on child safety topics and works closely with law enforcement agencies to help train officers and civilians about the importance of community vigilance. The salute she received from Lieutenant Rodriguez and his fellow officers remains the most treasured moment of her life, not because of the personal recognition, but because of what it represented. The acknowledgement that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, and that ordinary citizens can make an extraordinary difference when they choose to care and act on what they observe. Tommy, now 8 years old and thriving, still stops by Sarah's office regularly to say hello and show her his latest school projects. Each time she sees his bright smile and energetic personality, Sarah is reminded of why her decision to pay attention and get involved that February morning was the most important choice she had ever made.